Hello and welcome to this Earth Debate, coming to you from the David Attenborough studio at the Natural History Museum in London. Welcome to those of you in the studio audience and to those of you who are joining us on the web. My name's Richard Black, and by day I'm an environment correspondent with the BBC, but today I have the pleasure of chairing this fourth Earth Debate in a series leading up to the Rio +20 meeting in June. So far we've discussed ecosystem services, we've discussed the green economy and what may lie beyond GDP, and we've discussed green cities. But tonight we're getting to the heart, or perhaps I should say the stomach of the issue, something that we can't live without: food. How can the world be fed in 2050 with a population of 9 billion when we're struggling actually to feed some of the world's population now, quite a large slice of the world's population? What would they be eating in 2050? How would the food be produced? And how can it be produced in such a way that it leaves space for nature? Because apart from anything else, without leaving space for nature, that would actually compromise the food production. Under what economic system will the food need to be produced in 2050? And what do we mean by we, given that the actual food system, such as it is largely made up of individual producers, traders and consumers making decisions on whatever basis is best for them? We welcome your views from the audience here, and also please do send us in your tweets. The hashtag is Earth Debates. That's Earth Debates, no punctuation, hashtag Earth Debates. Get your tweets in as soon as possible, and our panel will have the best chance to debate them. And our panel is, I'm delighted to say, 4 people here with all the considerable expertise to shed on the subject. Next to me is Sue Dibb, who's Executive Director of the Food Ethics Council, which is a charity that aims to put ethics at the heart of debates about food production. She used to work for the Sustainable Development Commission here in the UK, and now lives in the town of Brighton, where she helps to run a sort of local effort aimed at getting sustainable food throughout the Brighton and Hove area. Next to Sue is Barry Gardner. He's the MP for Brent North here in London. He's held a host of environment-related posts in government, including being a minister for the environment. He's also been Tony Blair's Special Envoy on Forestry, and now is Ed Miliband's Special Envoy on Climate Change. Next to Barry is John Ingram, from the Natural Environment Research Council, Food Security. Well, he's the leader of that food security programme based in Oxford University, extensive experience of working in Africa and Asia, and also with considerable African experience. On the end is Camilla Toulmin, an economist by trade originally. She's now the director of the International Institute for Environment and Development, which works on all kinds of interrelated issues: climate change, agriculture, water, and rural livelihoods. John, let me come to you first of all, and we're talking about 2050, but there are obstacles at the moment, aren't there, to feeding the world's population as it is. Now, are those obstacles simply a question of food production, or is there more tied up in it?
There's absolutely more tied up in that. I'm glad you've zeroed in on food production, because that in itself isn't the fundamental issue. We do have, as you know, a billion people who don't have enough food. We have another billion who don't have sufficient nutrition. We can argue we have another billion who have too much. So maybe 3 out of 7 billion have got the wrong food system operating for them. Overall, we produce about 4,500 calories per person per day. As we probably all know, we need something in the order of 2,000, 2,200. So why is there a problem? Obviously, it's not one of production. To answer your point.
What is it then? Is it distribution? Is it buying power? Is it different types of food? What is it?
Well, all of those things. But I think fundamentally, as we talk about food security, we have to be thinking about access to food. That's really what it's about. We need to have a food system, or a series of food systems which allow equitable access, and that we don't have at the moment. Access, physical access. So is the distribution system sufficient? Is the storage system sufficient? We need to have economic access. Is food affordable? It is for the majority of us, comfortably. For many people in the world, it just isn't.
Not for that 2 billion that you were talking about.
Correct. And are the trade arrangements satisfactory? So all of that really puts the spotlight on the governance of the food systems of the world. Where is the power, who's in charge, and how do we as society address the imbalances that we see manifest today. But I do think, if I may just add one other point, the particular hobby horse at the moment is the amount of waste, and I'm sure others will pick up on this. I think you will, Sue. But it is a real blight on our society at the moment, the amount of food that's wasted.
Now, Camilla, food production doesn't exist in isolation, of course. When we talk about food production, it has environmental impacts. It needs water, it needs, well, lots of it needs chemicals at the moment, and it produces greenhouse gases. And a major report that came out just a couple of weeks ago made the point that if the world is to be fed in 2050 with leaving space for nature and so on, it needs to be climate friendly. What's really meant by climate friendly agriculture?
Essentially, the agricultural system and the food system as a whole, when you add in supermarket trolleys and all of that, generates a large amount of greenhouse gases. But the land on which food is grown can also absorb a large amount of carbon from the atmosphere. Trying to make sure that the agricultural sector is absorbing more than it's emitting is what climate smart or climate friendly agriculture might look like. Essentially, it means producing more food on the same amount of land with fewer inputs. We can't afford to keep on chopping down trees, keep on bringing new land into cultivation. We need to use the clever intelligence that we have to focus our knowledge better on the land that we've got.
Does that in turn mean focusing on specific types of food and perhaps eliminating others?
Well, I think there's certainly a big question around whether we should be growing as much grain as we are, particularly because we're putting almost half of that into the mouths of animals that use that very inefficiently to turn into steak. I think as we had maybe 20 years ago debates about our human right to be allowed to smoke, I think we'll also have debates going forward about the extent to which we've got a human right to eat red meat.
We might see beef eaters sort of banished outside restaurants and forced to munch their steak in the rain.
Out in the cold.
Now, Sudhib, John really gave you your cue talking about waste. In the West, we do throw away a heck of a lot of food, don't we?
We do. Something like a third of the food in our households goes to waste, and half of that could have been eaten. And then if you add onto that the amount of waste that gets lost in the food chain, it's too much. It's far too much.
So none of us would want to waste food. So why do we? Is it economics?
Yes, you could argue that food is too cheap, for example. We're encouraged to overconsume in many ways, to buy more. That's good for the supermarkets, that's good for the suppliers, if we are buying more than we actually need. But of course it's really bad for the planet, and it's really bad when you're thinking about having to feed 9 billion people in the future. Because I used to think, if I wasted food, what difference would that make in the world? You know, I'm sure many of us were brought up, eat up, so because you have to think of the starving children in Africa. And many of us thought, well, actually, it's not going to make any difference to the starving children in Africa whether this goes in the bin. But we now know the interconnectedness of the food system, that it does have an impact. Not only does food going to a landfill produce methane, which is a highly toxic greenhouse gas, but if all those resources that have gone into producing that food is just wasted, it pushes up prices on global grain markets, for example, if it's wasted. And that really does have an impact in the world. If we're pushing up food prices, that's making food far less accessible to those people, poorer people in the world.
Those 2 billion people that John was talking about earlier on.
It's not going to do anything to create a fairer, equitable food system. And of course, there's two sides to this. There's the underconsumption. There's those people who are too poor, and then there's that massive overconsumption, the huge problems of obesity, not just in the developed world, but we're now exporting that into the developing world. Growing rates of obesity, problems of ill health, diet-related ill health that's associated with that. Massive problems, for example, like diabetes, on health systems that can't even cope with existing problems. We're really storing up some huge problems. But it can be addressed.
All right, we'll come back to ideas on how to reduce waste later on. One of Barry's accomplishments that I should have mentioned earlier is that he's very prominent in the GLOBE International Organisation of Legislators. Now, GLOBE is looking ahead to the Rio +20 summit, quite a lot of involvement in trying to shape what comes out of it. So try and tie together, if you can, Barry, this huge system we have for food production and distribution, which is not really a system at all, and how you try to deal with that in a global policy instrument such as Rio +20.
Okay, that nice easy question. I think the first thing to say is that all of us who are looking forward to Rio +20 basically are doing so because we have an interest in one form or another in the environment. But if you go and talk to the people who have an interest in transport, if you go and talk to the people who are perhaps special advisors in the Treasury or special advisors in the Department of Health, they probably have, even if they've heard of Rio, have no interest in it at all. And actually that's the problem. The problem is that it is a disjuncted area of government and governance. And what we need to do is we need to look at this as an area which is of primary importance, first of all, to the Treasury. Unless you get through to the Treasury, unless you get through to finance departments, you don't actually resonate with politicians, and therefore you don't get the governance structure right. Now you talked about, is this a matter of economics when you were talking to Sue? And of course, what are we talking about here? We're talking about economics. We're talking about the allocation of scarce resources. What else is economics but the allocation of scarce resources? And therefore, if you're looking to how you distribute food amongst 9 billion people, and beyond that even, this is the most complex question of administrative justice that the world has ever faced, because it is mixed up with climate change. It is mixed up with all these other issues like global oceans governance, which
and to do those development issues such as poverty alleviation, for example.
Absolutely. So what we have to do is we have to find a way where this is not just your and my particular interest, where it's not just something that because we happen to care about, I know somebody here from the Bat Conservation Trust, somebody here, whatever it is that we care about, that's not enough. It has to be a central issue for governments, because if it's not, we have conflict.
Do you think that, though, that governments generally, certainly in the West, will be concerned simply about providing enough food for their citizens?
Well, here you have the United Nations problem. And the United Nations problem is a very simple one. It's that each government has to do the best it can for its own citizens. And what that means is you have writ large across the globe a paradox of the commons. If everybody does selfishly the best for their own citizens, then what we don't end up with is the best for the global structure and system as a whole. But if you want to create peace, if you don't want conflict, then the best way to do that is to create justice. And if you want to create justice, the best way to do that is to live sustainably. So we have to see the interconnectedness here, and it's only when we get this to be important to all the other disciplines are we then going to be able to get a governance structure that reflects that reality.
Well, let me open this to all of you then. I mean, I know, Camilla, you're looking at Rio. John, you're looking at Rio, perhaps Sue not quite so much. But, I mean, how do you think Rio can actually take this issue of sustainable agriculture forwards?
I think it's not just sustainable agriculture. I think we need to see Rio as the occasion where we get embedded throughout our economic system the issue of sustainability. And that's why I'm really pleased that we've got green economy as one of the two major elements for the summit, because it's not until you rewire our economic system with prices and values that properly reflect their real scarcity and the externalities that they impact on other parts of the system. That's key. I mean, I completely agree with Barry that we've got to, I wish George Osborne had bought his plane ticket and was looking forward to going there. My worry is that he, like many others, they'll go to the G20 in Mexico. They won't bother to do the 3-hour hop down to Rio, and somehow we've got to find a way of making people like that understand that this is critical.
So for you then, is this food debate really one element of a much wider debate about economic systems?
It's a much wider debate about economic systems that properly reflect scarcity, but that also deliver justice for people across the world. At the moment, we've got a system which has been built up entirely at random, in which much more powerful groups and nations are able to get what they want at the expense of others. We've got to find a way to shift that.
Yeah. John?
I think one of the valuable points of what we've just been talking about is to think of it as food systems rather than agricultural systems, because that maps much more satisfactorily to the green economy wish, because there are so many more actors and enterprises, if one looks at the whole food system, than just the egg production base. One can see many more opportunities for green economy.
Give us a couple of, or one or two concrete suggestions then, John, in terms of the way that the global food system works now. Pick out one or two things that you would like to see reformed in quite specific ways.
Well, I'm not sure I would be totally comfortable with the notion of the global food system. There are myriad food systems at work.
Indeed.
It's highly complex. But I think in terms of the distribution of food, particularly in a crisis, one could look for improved physical infrastructure in a region, a subcontinental region. Everything as sensible as having common railway gauges, for instance, between neighbouring countries to allow the rapid movement of food, to the harmonisation of quarantine regulations at borders, which can be a serious structural impediment. So those sorts of distribution things, but really it's, as I was saying earlier, it boils down to the equitable access to food, and that's fundamentally the affordability of food. That's got to be the most important. Maps back to the economics, but I'm looking at the sort of the pound, the dollar value of economics rather than the broader concept Barry was referring to.
Can I just pick up on something else, because we were talking about supermarkets, and what strikes me is we have to change as consumers as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, and I don't know if this is an experience anybody else had on Easter Saturday, but I left it too late to buy my Easter eggs for my children. And so I had to go round, I can't tell you how many different supermarkets, and could not find an Easter egg anywhere. And of course I was furious as a consumer. But when you think about it, as an economist, as a politician, as an environmentalist, I should have been delighted because the supermarkets for once had got it right. They weren't going to be wasting all this chocolate the day after.
They'd match supply to demand.
They'd match supply to demand. Well, not quite, because I
in your
was,
case,
I was still
one
not able to
consumer,
get my kids chocolate eggs. But we as consumers don't want to go into a supermarket thinking that they might not have the tomatoes, that they might not have the bread. We don't want to be the last person in there to get the last loaf off the shelf. We want to go in and see packed shelves and have that choice. Now, what that means is that the last person in that supermarket at 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening still wants that choice, and if what we say is true, they can't have it. They shouldn't have it, because what it means is that the waste of all the other loaves on that shelf should actually be feeding other people in the food chain.
And there are a lot of people, Barry, I think, who would, perhaps not in this constituency, who would listen to you saying, for example, things like people have to do this, people have to do that, and they would instinctively react to that and say, it's my right to buy whatever food I want, and so on and so forth. But Sue, this is one of the things that you work on, isn't it? Sort of behaviour change. What, can you give us some examples of things that are actually working to take consumers down the sort of road that Barry was elucidating of consuming more wisely, consuming only what they need, not throwing away so much?
Yes, because there has been a lot of emphasis on waste, and one of those changes is you don't see so much now the buy one get one free. They were shown, particularly around the area of fruit and vegetables, to be enormously wasteful. Because it sits there and you put them in your shopping trolley and you're tempted, but you know, how many apples or oranges in your small family are you going to eat before they've gone off? Supermarkets came under a lot of pressure, and by and large they've stopped those.
Pressure
so that's one
from
example.
Consumers?
Oh, and from government actually. And I think that's really important when you're thinking about what's going to make a difference here. Consumers, yes, they do have pressure in the marketplace, but actually it's the retailers who are the really powerful ones here. They say they listen to consumers, and to some extent they do, but they're also looking at what their competitors are doing. You need to bring governments into this. You can't leave it to the market. If you left it all to the market, we wouldn't necessarily get those kinds of changes that we need to see. So I think working with retailers and food manufacturers, governments setting them some targets. We've seen that around some of the health issues. We're starting to see that, I think, around waste. There's much more that can be done within the catering industry, within the food industry and retailers as a whole around waste. And not just about waste. If we're thinking about sustainable diets, there's many other areas where retailers, if we think about sustainable fish, for example, that's an issue that's become highlighted enormously, about the damage that the oceans, that we've done to the oceans by overfishing, the waste of discarding fish. It's been raised as a public issue. We've got celebrity chefs perhaps who've got behind that.
And now you've got systems that put a label on fish that enable you to buy what you like to buy.
Exactly. But the retailers can do that by choice editing for us. They can take the least sustainable ones off the shelves. They say they're not going to stock it. So for us as consumers, it can be very difficult to understand what you should and shouldn't buy to do the right thing. And most people do want to do the right thing.
Would you like to see beef taken off the shelf?
I think it's a little premature to think about taking beef off the shelf. I think we've got to start raising awareness of the impacts of meat production. And that's something that most consumers really, we haven't even started that conversation. And I've been talking with policymakers, and governments are highly sensitive. They talk about climate-friendly diets, they talk about low-impact diets. But actually, what does that mean? It actually means basing your diets a lot more around vegetable and plants and less on animal production.
I'm going to take some questions and points from the audience here in the David Attenborough studio in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to turn to our Twitter account first. And remember, a reminder, if you've got a point you'd like to make, question you'd like to raise, the hashtag is EarthDebates. Now, we've got quite a few questions in here from Ethiopia, and the first one of these I'd like to throw over to one of our two Old Africa hands. The question is this: how can we complement the effort to increase agricultural productivity with existing indigenous knowledge?
Well, if I may take that, I spent quite a lot of my childhood in Ethiopia, and it was one of those magical experiences that made me think that working on development issues would be really interesting and fun, and it turned out to be true. I think it's very important that we see how you can blend the best of modern science with the knowledge and understanding that farmers in any particular locality have. There's been a tendency in the past to, once people get trained, for them to think, I'm the expert, I've got all the answers. And of course you may have the answers in your own domain, but every practical problem of how you improve productivity in a particular place demands that you blend that knowledge and understanding with what the local population has, which is an in-depth. It may not be formalized, but it's a feel for how things work in that place.
So have you come across any situations in which those two things have been blended well?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of work around what they call participatory breeding of different varieties of crops, of lentils, of a variety of pulses, in fact in Ethiopia, and of their main grain crop, teff, where scientists have worked alongside farmers to understand what kind of characteristics work best, what they'd like to see in the value of that crop in terms of the grain or its ease of cooking. And it's particularly important to make sure that women farmers are also brought into that conversation, because they're often kind of drawing water, kept off on one side. But actually women need to be part of that conversation to say, you know, well, for me, the characteristics that would help in terms of producing a nutritious meal for my family are X, Y, and Z. Just see if you can try and build that into.
Fascinating. So that could actually feed right back to crop scientists who potentially might even be working in another country. Sure.
I think the generic point is the sort of the realization that a whole host of types of knowledge are valuable, and that as we're looking to solutions to feed the present population, let alone the future population, we need to look deep in the toolbox and not chuck out anything at this stage, and to be inclusive rather than exclusive in our use of knowledge. And the way we manage our systems, whether it's our whole food system or just our agricultural system, we need to see a rapidly enhanced knowledge use efficiency, if I can use that phrase. But it does mean,
of course, scientists have to get out of their lab, get out of their Land Rover, get into the field, find a way in which they can engage and have that conversation.
And the regime of their funding and their employment has to allow for that, presumably, as well.
But I do think that, I mean, that is a whole other branch of research of how we communicate across these different worldviews. And that is a researchable entity in its own right.
Barry, here's a tweet from Ethiopia, which I'll throw to you, if that's all right. You can tell it's a tough one coming up, can't you? How can we fully eliminate the corruption and sideline businesses in food aid? I guess the question is making the assumption that businesses do need to be sidelined in food aid, which might be a whole separate debate. But
well, look, I think the issue of corruption is absolutely horrendous and complex. Certainly in terms of food aid, you can do that by flattening your delivery structures. And that's something that the UK government has actually been very good at doing. And this government, although it's not my flavour, has actually done that and made a concerted effort to flatten those structures to try and eliminate some of the corruption that was going on there. But there's much more to it than that. What you find, particularly in developing countries where they're heavily reliant, particularly on extractive industries, is you find that the whole public polity is captured by those industries, so that local politicians can only get elected because they rely on the funding that comes from, you know, the mining companies, the extractive industry companies, the forestry companies, and so on. And therefore you find that they then act not to facilitate reform in government, not to facilitate progress, but actually to block it. And that's a much deeper form of corruption. It's not just, you know, skimming off the breadbasket of an aid programme. This is a really deep form of corruption that is happening in many countries now, where the whole public democratic structure is corrupted and is then a blockage to process. And we have to think very carefully about that interaction between democracy, delivering our sort of democracy, delivering what people really want and what people really need in those countries.
And have you come across any strategies where that is being tackled effectively?
Yes, but of course it would be invidious to name the countries and the politicians.
Okay. Let's not do that. All right, let me come to our audience here in the hall. You've been specially invited and it's great to have you here. Let's take a couple of points. First of all, there's a lady right in the middle. Please just tell us who you are, please, as well.
Hello, my name's Vicky Hurrell. I'm here representing the World Society for Protection of Animals, but actually I also work for Friends of the Earth, so I have two hats on. And I work on the food programme at Friends of the Earth. So I'm particularly interested in looking at solutions and policy levers which will help us deliver a food system which feeds people, as you've been talking about, but also within the planetary boundaries that we're facing, reduces the pressure on our nutrient load and overloading and abuse, and biodiversity and climate change problems. I did want to redress the balance on livestock, though, because beef isn't the big problem, only big problem, because pigs and poultry obviously use a large proportion of the grain and protein produced globally, and that should be part of the system. Yeah, so pigs and poultry and dairy as well. I did want to ask Barry, because you are obviously a politician, and I wanted to ask you, what are we going to do about this issue of sustainable diets that Sue brought up? Because I've been working on this for many years, and as soon as we start talking about it, we've got a lot more evidence now about the fact that our consumption of meat products is causing problems with access to food, as well as many environmental problems. Whenever anybody starts talking about that, their head goes down, so yeah, we have to reduce, it's always the head goes down, yes, we have to do something about this. How do we put our heads up and say, what are we going to do? How are we going to help it? And I've actually been in lots of debates where eventually when you talk to people about it, you explain the problems, they say, oh yeah, I could put some lentils in the beef stew and use less beef, or I can do something differently. I could cook. They don't actually react as hostilely as politicians think they do, but how can we get over the political...
Let's get Barry's view on that now.
Okay, look at what happened with fish fight, okay? Politicians like me had been standing up in Parliament talking about overfishing, talking about discards, doing all of that, getting nowhere, right? One celebrity chef stands up and says, this is obscene that we are, throwing back these fish into the sea, and suddenly it becomes fashionable to be serving up fish that nobody, gurnard and so on, that nobody would have dreamt of eating. So I agree with you. I'm just not sure that I'm the best person to be telling people. I actually think that this is a much better message to come from the people who people trust to prepare food, namely their chefs. And if the chef comes along and says, look, here are some recipes to do this, you'll actually find more traction. But we can't legislate for people to put lentils in their beef lasagna.
But there may be a counter side to this as well, because if you have chefs who are coming along producing gorgeous looking meat dishes and so on, it can go the other way, can't it?
Well, it could. I think what we need is much better education. And if you look at the way in which domestic science has all but disappeared in many schools from the syllabus, to bring domestic science back in as something that's important for everybody to learn, and to teach it in terms of sustainability. It's actually one of the things in the Zero document for Rio. It's there about teaching sustainability from an early age in schools. It talks about tertiary education as well, but it focuses on getting people to understand sustainability as an essential feature of their lives from an early age. Now that is something that I think as politicians we can intervene on, and that we can be much more proactive on, in making sure that it's there in the education system. But I'm not sure we're the best people to tell people about the lentils. Now, in the best traditions of BBC Balance, I've taken one question from my right. I'm going to take another question from my left. So there's a gentleman there with a microphone.
I'm Roy Tindell. I represent the London Thames Gateway Forum. There's one word I haven't heard, and that's finite.
In terms of resources or
yes,
land?
We live on a finite planet. And one of the problems with the Anthropocene is not just what human beings are doing, but there's so damn many of us. And I think one of the issues we have to grasp with, especially in the Attenborough Theatre, is the fact that the human race is growing and growing and growing, and will outstrip very soon the resources that are there. Now, this is not just a general question. I think there are specifics. I was addressing a conference in Cambridge University last year when I raised the issue of phosphates running out. And a good friend of mine, Paul Eakins of UCL, said, oh, we've heard all these scare stories before, it's not going to happen, Roy, come on. And two mining engineers stood up and said, oh yes it is, we're running out. We're also running out of copper. 25 years. So how do we deal with this when we perhaps haven't got to 2050? How do we deal with the issues of wasting resources? Let me mention one point. And that is, we throw away a resource we once used, and that's human waste. I don't think we can afford to do that much longer.
Well, let me throw that across to John. Perhaps you'd like to pick up that resource question.
Sure. I mean, the whole notion of resource use efficiency, I think, is the nub of the answer. I won't go down the finite road at the moment. The lady here mentioned the planetary boundaries, and those have been thrashed out in the scientific literature to some great extent. But I'm going to use the word wiser use of resources is really where we need to be heading. And that's all resources, and I include knowledge. I've mentioned that already. Knowledge is one of our principal resources, and we don't appreciate that and use it in the best possible way. But some things such as phosphate are worrisome. And if we can establish food production systems which are not so reliant on new sources of phosphate, but actually are able to recycle and get better resource use efficiency of what we have already in the system, i.e. stop leakage, then we're well on the road to addressing the problem, if not actually solving it.
So it's partly more a sort of intelligent direction of research, apart from anything else.
Well,
really.
it's certainly an intelligent direction of research, but going back to the societal level, which is really what we're talking about, that we all use what we have more wisely. I mean, that's got to be the bottom line.
There's an interesting tweet that's come in here, Sue, which is relevant to this very question. This is from Mike Zimoni. He says, it's really tough for us to know what to buy and what not to buy, and he'd like a bit more sort of consumer awareness. So, I mean, some of these questions are quite subtle, aren't they? Resource usage and so on. You can see a scenario where consumers are bombarded with all sorts of information about what's green in very different ways. I mean, what's the best approach
and we
here?
know that there's a lot of confusion out there, and it's not surprising when you've got companies trying to gild the lily sometimes on their green credentials. That's why I think it is really important. I'll come back to, for example, the role of government. It's not a question of telling people what to do, but it's about providing authoritative information. And on sustainable diets, we were in a process of working towards the Food Standards Agency being able to provide information so that people could much more clearly, and it came with authority, because yes, there's numerous books out there, there are sources of information, but you know, you're never quite sure whether you should trust them, and that's why I think where we lack at the moment within government, everything's gone back to its departments. We've got health over here, we've got environment over there. Actually, when we're talking about what is good for the planet, it's also often what's good for our health as well. But actually understanding that in a way that is usable by consumers, which the food industry can support, which government can do something about through its public procurement processes, through about its food in hospitals and its food in schools. It's enormous potential here. And I don't quite understand the reluctance to engage in this area. We haven't got anyone from the current government here, I don't think, but I do.
I wouldn't ask you to answer on behalf of the current government, Barry, but perhaps you can
real
answer
opportunities that I just
give us
think
a sort of an answer on behalf of the class politic overall.
No, Sue's absolutely right that authoritative information is really helpful. And I think we were working towards that, and it does seem to have lost traction. Can I go back to one of the points that the gentleman raised, though, on this issue of limits? And it's simply this, that the best way to reduce population growth is to educate girls. And, you know, I know it may seem silly to answer about a food issue by talking about educating girls in developing countries. But for every extra year that a girl spends in education in a developing country, I think the figures show that she produces one less child. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. And we can't look at this and say, well, there are limited resources, therefore we've got to stop people breeding, and we've got to put in, you know, programs of one-child policies and things like that. I mean, let's recollect that the Chinese one-child policy has actually stopped 400 million extra carbon footprints, 400 million extra mouths to be fed. But the best way to tackle that crush between population growth and finite resource is educate girls.
There's also a deal of evidence out there, is there not, also to show that as communities, some of the poorest communities become a little bit richer, then sort of reproduction rates and so on will slow down a little bit, and there's more scope for interventions. And we had a tweet in from Ethiopia, Camilla, perhaps you could pick this up, which is very relevant to this question, which is asking how producers of food in the poorest countries can be assured of getting a fair price, so they're actually getting something back for the food they're producing.
Well, that's to do partly with infrastructure, as John was saying, but also with knowledge and access to marketing arrangements. Actually, Ethiopia is a very interesting example where they've set up recently a commodity exchange which is based on mobile phones, which allows farmers to find out what the price is in more distant markets, make a contract and then deliver the product. What had been happening before was you'd got a number of very powerful traders who basically controlled the whole flow of commodities from farmer to market. Now that power has been broken. So I think there's a whole set of the mobile phone actually has been a transformatory tool in the hands of poor people, particularly in Africa.
Fantastic. Let me come to a gentleman over here, please, if you would.
My name is Sharifin Gardner. I don't think we're related.
You can compare family trees afterwards.
I'm also an old Africa and an Asia hand, but I started adult life as a sheep farmer. Firstly, two observations. There are something like, I think, 500 million pastoralist farmers all across the Sahel in the drier parts of Asia. Their lives depend on livestock. And also, when I started life in farming, we believed in lay farming, and so we did alternative sheep and grass. And there's nothing wrong with grass-fed sheep and grass-fed beef, and we need to support our hill farmers in the Highlands and in Wales.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. A secondary observation, the smaller the farm, if it's well managed, the likelier is the total output per unit area. And the third thing I want to say is I've been listening to a wonderful lady from Kenya who is the spokesman for an organization of 250,000 dairy farmers, all doing agroecological farming. And she says that the difference between food sovereignty and food security, if it's food sovereignty, we grow food ourselves with our own seeds, and we don't buy any fertilizer. And food security, oh well, we depend on that from somebody else. And I'd be very interested to hear what the panel has to say about the differences between security and sovereignty.
Fascinating panoply of issues. Thank you. Camilla, would you like to?
Well, I think I'd better come back on that meat issue, because I've obviously stirred up your desire to say not all beef is the same, and I completely agree. I think if you're looking at grass-fed livestock systems, our uplands or equally the Sahel, there you've got the basis for a perfectly sustainable livelihood, and one that brings good incomes and milk and dairy to the population that's looking after them. My point is that I don't think we can afford to put whatever it is, 45% of our grain and our soya through these manufactured sort of meat, horrible factories where animals are kept in appalling conditions and stuffed full of grain that could be feeding people directly. So I think we have to break down different kinds of meat, different kinds of livestock system.
What about this point of the relative size of farms and how that works?
Because also, I'm very glad you made that point, because there's a big debate in the literature about, are smallholders on their way out? Surely we should sweep them away because they're no longer efficient, and we should go for large-scale commercial farming. I mean, again, I think we create a false dichotomy. For an awful lot of crops, smallholder farms are indeed the most efficient way to produce those crops. But that's not true for all crops. I think you'd find, certainly with some of the large plantation crops that we've got of sugar and of palm oil to some extent, you've actually got a level of economy of scale. Actually, quite a lot of grain farms as well. where actually it does make more sense to operate at a scale beyond that a family can manage themselves.
Now, we've got about 15 minutes left of this discussion, so if you're watching online and would like to get your point or your comment or your question across, please don't hesitate. Tweet us now. The hashtag is #EarthDebates. Gentleman over there, please.
I'm Andrew Ross from Global Garden Limited, and I'm from the City of London and the banking industry. And I'd like to bring this back to the economics of the matter. What's missing here is a valuation of the ecosystem services which are behind the supply chain which goes in to the supermarkets. And a particular missing word we haven't yet heard is the value of the water. And the water primarily comes from the highlands and the rainforests, and that is where the valuation of the ecosystem services begins. Now, in that context, Rio +20 is going to be looking at the value of REDD+, the RED+ forest policy. Here's the critical instrument, in my view, and I'd really welcome your views on it too, because the City of London is ready and waiting to apply bond instrument valuations on any instrument that pulls together a credible portfolio of projects into a deliverable financial model. And that's the role of Rio. If it could bring together the sustainability discussions with a red policy, you've got a winning agenda.
Okay,
Can
Barry.
it be delivered?
Is it going to happen?
This is music to my ears. I chaired the 2-day session at Nagoya for the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, where we discussed valuation of natural capital. We put forward the protocol on valuation of natural capital there. And you're absolutely right that the critical thing is to ensure that the true value of ecosystem services is being reflected, not just in food chains and ultimately in retail and food, but absolutely across the board. And you link that very neatly, if I may say so, with RED+, the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And there I chair the Forest Legislators Initiative, which has been going on between Mexico, Brazil, DRC and Indonesia, trying to get the legislation in those countries RED-ready. And you're right, the sort of funding flows that are required, though, here are enormous. I tend to think that, you know, there are different models for RED, and if you speak to Brazilians, they will tell you that the Brazilian government's very clear. They want a fund-based system. They don't want it market-based. They don't want it coming from the markets. They wanted a fund-based system that's coming from developed countries, putting that money on the table usually in a bilateral and multilateral way. So there are political obstacles here, but they're not insurmountable. And I think what we need, the great tragedy in Indonesia, of course, was that the Rimba Raya project, which was going to attract huge flows of capital in, I think even Gazprom from the Soviet Union had bought up a stake in Rimba Raya, was axed in half by the forestry ministry there in Indonesia, that sold off half the whole thing for a mining concession. And this is where you see different arms of government conflicting and completely cutting across what could have been the gold standard of the RED+ process.
John, there's a tweet here which goes to the heart of something that we were talking about before we came into the hall and had this discussion, so I'd just like your quick word on this. This comes from Ethiopia, and the question is, how can we complement government funding of research and development through private capital? And interestingly, when we were chatting beforehand, you were making the point that in some cases the research has gone too far to the private end, in your view.
Well,
there's more need for public money.
That did come up in conversations. Sure, it's a question of research into what, and what's the motive for that research. Obviously, the private sector has got a massive research and very valuable research arm. Let's not shy away from that. contribute enormously to the increase of knowledge.
I guess our question in Ethiopia would like to see a bit more of it going into research in his country.
There is a huge private sector investment of research in this country in the agricultural domain. I can't speak across the food system. I don't know enough about that yet, but certainly, I mean, many companies are working, investing hugely in the resource base for the UK, for the temperate zone. The question is, are they researching into what are often called the marginal crops?
And in your view, is it being well directed or not?
No, generally not, because the marginal crops are by and large left to the public sector research arm, because there isn't the necessary profit to be made, which of course is the driver for a private enterprise. One can't escape that fact. But the work they do is excellent. Is it on the right balance of crops? Possibly not.
Something that one guesses will be discussed in Rio, even if it's not actually resolved in Rio. Now, perhaps we could get a microphone down to the second row back on my right-hand side, and while that's happening, let's go to the other side of the hall. Gentleman right at the back there.
Hi, Adam Scott from Keogh Films. Given the dysfunctional nature of the common fisheries policy and common agricultural policy, isn't food a subject that the EU should be hanging its head in shame over in Rio?
Barry.
I thought you might come to me on that one.
It isn't all your fault, really, but you know.
Very simple answer, yes. Absolutely. I mean, it's monstrous. And if you look at the way in which Commissioner Damanaki is now trying to reform the common fisheries policy, I went to the thing in the European Parliament where all parliamentarians from all across Europe came together there, put Q&A to her. She was brilliant. She was lucid. She was absolutely clear about exactly why the sort of reforms that she's proposed are necessary and essential, not to stop fishers having a proper livelihood and fishing communities, but to ensure that they have a continuing livelihood into the future. And she was absolutely brilliant, and yet you still had different countries and legislators from all around Europe ganging up against her. And my fear is that we're going to see a very much diminished set of proposals once it's been through from the Commission and the Council and comes back out of the Parliament eventually. It is a cause for shame, and it's not just what we're doing around Europe, it's what we're doing off the west coast of Africa as well, and that is criminal. It's absolutely criminal theft, because we're going into those territorial waters and we're taking away the livelihoods of artisanal fisheries on the west coast of Africa.
But that's because their governments have sold those
Absolutely.
fishing rights.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Let's come straight across here to a question from Derek Osborne.
Derek Osborne, President Stakeholder Forum. And before making my question, I wanted to say, as one of the organisers, thank you very much to everybody for a very stimulating panel discussion and set of questions. My question is bringing us back to Rio and what can actually be achieved there. And to those of us who've been attending some of the rather turgid discussions in New York so far, you get a bit depressed. But one promising idea that has been emerging that hasn't been mentioned yet is the idea of creating a new set of sustainable development goals for the next 15 years. The Millennium Development Goals that were established in 2000 have been moderately successful in focusing development effort over the last 10, 12 years and actually achieving some real achievements in poverty reduction and so on. The idea of sustainable development goals, as I understand it, put forward by Colombia and others, is that we should now be more ambitious and we should go for goals that are not just about the developing countries, the poorer countries, but are matched with goals for the developed and the rich countries, and demand on their side that we actually take seriously what we've been talking about this evening, setting ourselves specific quantified goals to be more resource efficient, to reduce our waste, to be less profligate. Would the panel like to comment on that and what they think of that as a Rio outcome?
Derek, I hope you don't mind, but I'm just going to hold that question until the end, because this is actually how I plan to finish the discussion on this very point. So it just proves that great minds think alike or something. I don't know what it proves. In the meantime, would you just mind just passing the microphone over your shoulder, Derek? There's a lady behind you. We're not hearing you. I don't know whether we can just make sure that mic's on. Would you?
I'm Midori, studying food policy in City University. Mr. Gardner mentioned about finance, and we do understand that today's financial and economic system is one of the main problems with this food system, global food system. And yes, evaluating water and resource is important, but I think before discussing about green economy, I think we should, because today's food system, it's cheaper to move around the food all over the planet, and it's cheaper to move around the documents, including the tax haven, and then make it profit. So I think it's more important to make this financial system to charge this long-distance trade properly and charge these companies' profit properly. I think it's more important, but I didn't hear about it, so can you
on the other
comment
hand, you can argue that trade can actually bring development benefits to some countries as well. So, Barry, do you want to have a quick go at that?
Well, look, you're right. The present system is not structured to deliver what we want. That's why we're here, palpably. But I do think that the whole business of a proper valuation of ecosystem services and a proper valuation of natural capital would allow us to restructure that system. Because critically what it enables decision makers to do is to form a proper, a correct, or a more accurate cost-benefit analysis of the actions that they're taking. Because instead of regarding these, and Camilla talked earlier about externalities, the classical economic system regards pollination services by bees, provision of water, clean air, soil stabilization, watershed protection as free goods. They're not. They have an intrinsic value. And sometimes that value we come up against in a very real way. But if we do understand that, then we take better decisions, and that will be reflected in the structures that then we adopt.
Right, very, very quick question from the lady there. It has to be quick.
Sue Riddlestone from Bioregional. I wish my question was quick. If you were the Prime Minister, all of the panel, thinking about we need to take responsibility in our own backyard. I mean, we did some analysis at Bioregional on what would a sustainable food system look like, and it was half as much meat, a third as much dairy, implement the RAP, Love Food, Hate Waste recommendations, implement the Food Climate Research Network, on-farm reductions in emissions and so on. So we know what to do. It's possible. It all adds up. We can make it add up to sustainability. We need to do our bit in the UK and lead the way. So I guess my question to the panel is, what would you do, to make sure that we actually implemented a sustainable food system that the world could learn from, perhaps,
right.
and do our bit?
As we've got 2.5 minutes left, I'm going to combine that with Derek Osborne's question, because some of what you're talking about may come out of Rio. So to make the global food system better in all the ways that we've been talking about, what would you like to see? Give us a wish list of just one or two each. Sue.
I think each country, and including the Prime Minister here in the UK, needs to see the value and importance of secure, healthy, ethical food systems, and have an integrated policy to prioritise that at a national level, including then your negotiations at an international level. But if you're not doing it in the UK, and we're currently not, then I don't see how you can even start elsewhere in the world.
But Barry, sustainable food consumption, a better food system from Rio?
Reduce waste, for developed countries, reduce waste, ensure that the valuation of natural capital is a part of your government accounting framework, and never let there be a cigarette paper between the goals of sustainability and the goals of development. And the point that you made in linking the sustainability goals with the Millennium Development Goals is absolutely right. They go together, they're part and parcel of what we're trying to do. You cannot have sustainable development without sustainable environment.
John Ingram.
I'd say we'd need to think about the governance structures of the way the food systems operate, and we'd look to harmonise more effectively the monocentric governance that we have in place, government, with what's termed the adaptive governance that is emerging through NGOs, through civil society.
And Camilla?
I'd sign up to a set of sustainable development goals that we can work through over the next 2-3 years to link up with the end of the MDG phase. I think that's absolutely critical, and that they have universal coverage, so it's not a question of us rich, you poor. We've all got a collective responsibility
Which
here.
would make them very different from the MDGs, wouldn't it? Well, that's all we have time for from this fourth and final Earth debate. Thanks very much to the panel. Sue Dibb, Camilla Toulmin along the end there, John Ingram and Barry Gardner MP. So we've heard lots of ideas discussed here over the last few weeks, and we'll wait and see whether the people in Rio take them up.